So we're right on schedule, and so Lloyd, if you'll join us on the panel after I give a brief presentation, we'll get into some questions. Great. Well, for those who don't know me, my name's Justin Bush. I've been in my role about 1.5 years now. Prior to taking this role, I was the executive coordinator of the Washington Invasive Species Council for 7 years, and cumulatively have been working to prevent and manage invasive species of all types for almost 20 years in Washington and the state of Texas. And really felt called when my predecessor retired to take this role. Number one, to lead governor's emergency to address European green crab on our coast, to successfully meeting its objectives, transitioning to long-term management. But then number two, thinking about the quagga and zebra mussel risk and thinking about all the different groups that have a role that could be devastated by invasive mussels felt compelled to step in. So that's kind of what I'm here for, and wanted to lead off with a conversation following Lloyd Knight explaining what the state of Washington perceives the risk to be currently and what we've been doing over a 1 year time due to the charge from our state legislature and Representative Mary Dye to think of things we could be doing and should be doing within 1 year to increase our readiness. So first off, just want to make it very clear, we're viewing the state of Washington as being under imminent threat. We know based off of calculations, looking at the distance from Twin Falls to our waters, there's 375 river miles distance. And ultimately, we just heard that quagga mussels were found 2 years in a row. And so ultimately, while there's severe uncertainty, we know the economic and the environmental damages will be vast and be something that will be long-term. And so just wanted to think about it in that way. We have been thinking a lot over the last year about downstream movement of invasive mussels, but it's also really worth looking at it from a slightly different perspective. How did the mussels get to the state of Idaho? Human-mediated activities. And then thinking about the movement of watercraft and other aquatic conveyances around the western United States. You can see that in the picture on the graph, the picture on the left, for example, watercraft that were inspected across the western United States that were last in the Twin Falls area. And so you can imagine this sort of map focused on Twin Falls from any different water body around the western United States. And it just paints that picture that there's multiple threat pathways. Rightfully so, we're focused a lot on the Snake River, but we can't forget about these other water bodies that are infested because they're also a threat. We learned in August that there are other pathways that are a threat for introducing invasive mussels to our jurisdiction. Took actually a long weekend in August and celebrated my 10-year anniversary, and came back in the morning and started to open my emails top down rather than bottom up. That was really great because one of the immediate first emails I opened was a picture from industry, from a wholesaler of aquarium products, showing a photo showing what's a suspected invasive mussel, which triggered a response working in partnership between two state agencies, the State Department of Agriculture, State Department of Fish and Wildlife, as well as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the U.S. Department of Agriculture, to respond. And as we started to dig into what we were finding in Washington, tracing back the populations, we realized it was actually an issue that was national in scope. We intercepted over 1,000 contaminated products with zebra mussels in Washington alone, based on information from a federal case investigating this illegal importation from Ukraine to the United States to the importer in Florida. That's 1,000 of 26,000 that were shipped across the United States. So again, we're working to address problems like that, but again, multiple threat pathways. This was one occurrence, and there certainly could be multiple other instances of contaminated products moving through industry. And Director Susswind mentioned golden mussels, and that could be a whole other briefing today, but ultimately there's a new threat on the horizon. An invasive mussel was recently found in California for the very first time, a first in the nation detection. It's not a dracaenid mussel. Essentially, it has the same risks, the same pathways as quagga and zebra mussels, but it's in a slightly different family and is from Southeast Asia. Yet, It has many similar effects. And so we're viewing this as a very similar risk, and we're starting to talk about invasive mussels more broadly. Working again to understand that risk, looking at watercraft movement, as well as thinking about transportation vectors such as ballast water that could bring invasive mussels into our freshwater ports. So we've heard multiple times that watercraft inspections are really the best preventative tool we have, and we're really lucky through partnerships with federal agencies, as well as facilitation through the Pacific States Marine Fisheries Commission, in bringing together all that information into one place. And I think that you're going to see a better map in later presentations, but on this map you can see all those different watercraft inspection stations operated by all the different organizations across the western half of North America. So everyone's working together to solve the same problem. Taking a quick look just at Washington's piece of that pie, you can see that we have 5 different mandatory watercraft inspection stations currently. We're working on a pilot station in Eastern Washington that we're going to be rolling out next year. More to come on that. But just wanted to highlight that over 50,000 watercraft have been inspected this year, 13 of which were fouled with invasive mussels. And so again, we need to not only be thinking about downstream movement, potentially from Idaho, but we need to be thinking about other areas that could be spreading invasive mussels into our area. And again, looking at when prevention fails, when you find an infested watercraft or other conveyance, you then take actions to decontaminate it so that you're rendering it so that it may not be established. And ultimately, this year we've decontaminated over 1,600 vessels. So 13 vessels had invasive mussels. The difference between that are invasive species on that watercraft, or potentially water that could be harboring veligers. So boats that were in infested water bodies that were intercepted. So we're not only protecting Washington from invasive mussels, but also other invasive species like freshwater plants. It's really great to hear Lloyd Knight talk about the value of early detection monitoring. And with increased state funding this year, we've actually increased monitoring efforts substantially. A 24% increase in sites monitored. And this was a lot of this focus was due to the increased effort on the Snake River and Lake Wallula. We were able to hire a new dedicated monitoring team of 2 that's doing nothing but sampling the Snake River. We're thinking of this as a delineation survey in a lot of ways. But we also couldn't forget about the rest of the state. How did mussels get into Idaho? We can't turn a blind eye to other water bodies that may be infested or may be contaminated. So we're continuing that overall monitoring effort. You enjoyed the video this morning, I hope. That was nominated for a Northwestern Emmy Award, but it was disqualified because we published it to YouTube prior to the deadline. But we're very proud of that video. You've seen you've seen some of these photos, but I just wanted to spotlight that when the Idaho detection was announced last year, we immediately took action in updating our state response plan. We didn't wait for increased funding. We took the funding we already had, and we worked to update our state response plan to look at lessons learned in terms of how do you validate whether a water body is infested, what steps do you take, what procedures. Sounds like in Idaho, the governor was very important in setting that compass for all organizations. We were trying to build that into our own response plan. And we really couldn't be doing what we're doing today without the increased support from our state legislature. We were fortunate to be provided $1.81 million in state general funds with the ability to then leverage $1.81 million in federal funds. And we're doing this through the Pacific States Marine Fisheries Commission currently, with funding provided by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And when our legislature heard about the infestation in Idaho, they met with our Department of Fish and Wildlife, and they challenged us to think about actions we could take in 1 year to get us to the point where we will be ready to respond. There's much more to do, but we've never been more ready. We're not going to dive into a lot of detail, but I really just wanted to start the conversation about what we can be doing together with this foundation of what we're currently doing now. And there's a lot of opportunities to get involved, and later you'll hear Raquel Crozier talk about a few of the different activities that are in process. And we're developing some new site-specific response plans. We're looking at mitigation system scoping analyses. There's all these opportunities for all of us that have a stake to get involved in these projects. So we are taking lessons learned from other jurisdictions. We're taking lessons learned from other invasive species responses broadly around the United States, and then taking a lot of information from our use of the incident command system to respond to European green crab due to Governor Inslee's executive emergency order to respond. And so we are developing structures and processes to provide input in the short term, as well as set the stage for long-term management. We're increasing watercraft inspections, increasing sampling. We're taking steps to procure another mussel sniffing dog, and you will meet Finn later this afternoon, and we'll have a space for you to take a photo with Finn if you'd like to document that experience. We are also looking at other pathways, and this was really great foresight because in August we found the contaminated Margen mossballs, the zebra mussels. So we were already thinking about retailers and trade and how to address that and improve processes. But there's other things that are moved, fish transport permits and fish stocking, for example. You wouldn't want a contaminated hatchery to be bringing infested fish or infested water into a lake and then be introducing that. So there's all sorts of things that need to be done, and we're taking action, but really we're inviting partnerships so we can take all these actions together. And really the message is also one of sharing communications and jointly developed messages. We're at a point where we can still prevent this problem. When it cannot be prevented, we can work to respond together. And really everybody has a role in that success. And for the public and anyone that's using watercraft or interacting with the water, the message is pretty simple. It's clean, drain, dry, simple preventative actions that can avoid millions of dollars in economic impacts as well as impacts in the environment. So we'll end with this, picture's worth 1,000 words, so I'm showing you two. And I think this says more than I can say in 10 minutes. And you know, this is really a call to action for all of us to think about this threat and think about how we can all contribute to this common mission of avoiding this problem or mitigating it for the least amount of effects. And with that, we're going to transition into a panel. Very pleased that Margen Carlson, our Director of Conservation, is able to join us. We'll invite back Deputy Director Lloyd Knight. And then I'm pleased to have Stephanie Helms, the Executive Coordinator of the Washington Invasive Species Council, joining us. So please make your way forward and we'll have a panel discussion. Okay, thank you. All right, well, I think first off, let's just start with a question for all. Well, actually, I think we have a few opening statements from each panelist, kind of explaining roles and perspectives, and then we're going to segue into a question that's scripted, and then we'll take it out to the room. Great, so Lloyd, you've already said a lot. Maybe start with Margen.
All right. Hi, everybody. Again, Margen Carlson here. I'm the Conservation Director for the Department of Fish and Wildlife. I'm so glad to see you all here and so glad to be able to be a part of it. I wanted to maybe set the stage from a bigger picture perspective, how at the department we're seeing the importance of our invasive species work fit into our overall mission and our overall conservation work, and then really bring home the idea that you've heard really from everybody so far today, which is the importance of partnerships. In my role as the conservation director, a lot of my work is about increasing the pace and scale of conservation. And as you've heard from other partners, this is something that not just the Department of Fish and Wildlife, but Washington State overall has really invested heavily in. And often the work that I do involves helping make sure that staff have the resources they need, taking advantage of policy or funding opportunities to increase that pace and scale of conservation. And mostly this is a really easy thing to do. As you all know, we live in a beautiful place. with beautiful ecosystems and fish and wildlife and landscapes that really capture people's heart. And that's really what we mean when we talk about biodiversity. It's the species, it's also the habitats they live in and how all those things interact to form an ecosystem. But increasingly, part of my work is also about preventing impacts to those fish and wildlife, and again, helping to support staff and partners to have the resources that they need and to coordinate. And so, of course, as we're here today to talk about invasive species is a big part of that threat to these ecosystems. So while we're here to talk mostly about invasive mussels, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the lessons that we can learn and the things that can help us have hope and confidence as we approach these invasive species. And I like to think about the work that we've done in oil spills as a nice analogy that some folks might be more familiar with: prevention, preparedness, and response. And I really appreciated Lloyd's presentation earlier, which sort of fleshed out the details of each of those tactics. But it's interesting because obviously for invasive mussels, prevention has worked incredibly well for us for a very long time through the hard work of many here. And there's tons of ecological literature that helps bring home this idea that prevention is a really effective strategy and often much more effective financially over the long term. But we also know that when the risk is present, as it is here today in this space, that there's additional tactics that we have to deploy that really become about containing and minimizing the threat to our ecosystems and infrastructure. So again, this is where we have some lessons to draw hope from, both from the invasive mussels response space, but also for some other species. And one piece that I wanted to highlight is the hope and response that we're seeing relative to bullfrog removal. So some of you may know that in Washington, we have a state endangered listed species, the western pond turtle. And there's a ton of effort with Department of Fish and Wildlife and partners really working on the recovery of that species. We knew the threat from invasive bullfrogs, and one of the things that I just learned recently is that in some of the spaces where we've worked in a concerted way with partners to remove invasive bullfrogs, we're now seeing really clear western pond turtle population responses. So again, it's not quite the same threat, it's not quite the same scope and scale, but I think what it illustrates is that when we know what the clear risk is, we know what the pathway is, and we know what some of the effective management techniques are, when we pull together with partners and coordinate and implement those actions, they really can be effective. And I think that's one of the things that's important given the scope and scale of the aquatic mussels risk, is having a little bit of that hope and having the confidence to move forward and implement those actions that we know can be effective. Another example that we can draw hope from, and I think Justin mentioned it earlier, European green crab is another aquatic invasive species that, again, we were able to work together with many tribal co-managers, in particular Lummi Nation. We worked with the governor's office, and we've been mounting an emergency response in Washington. And you got a little glimpse through the nearly award-winning video of when we implement emergency management response and we have that structure in place, it really provides a coordinated and predictable way for many, many partners, tribal governments, others who are invested in managing the threat, to work together, share information, and share resources. And again, I learned recently at a symposium of the affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians that Lummi Nation in particular has been seeing really positive results of the trapping that they've done in the case of European green crab to manage that population. So again, that hope is really important. So I think the thing I wanted to end on before passing it over to Stephanie, really specifically for the Department of Fish and Wildlife, much like any one entity, and I heard Lloyd speak to this as well, no one entity can do this alone and be effective in managing something like the invasive mussel risk. But what we've learned through some of these other efforts that we can do that can be incredibly helpful is act as a center point for that coordinated response, using what we know about implementing emergency management structure and responses to really help all of the partners, other governments, including tribes, other local partners, community partners, to really build and empower, I think, that local ongoing coordinated response. So in the near terms, you heard a little bit from Justin, and we'll hear more from Mikkel later. We know there are specific actions that we can continue to do to maintain that capacity for response. And then we also know over time, as we've seen with the green crab response, that we can build that local capacity for more partners to become a part of the management response. That involves training, that involves sharing information and best practices, coordinating across all the responders to make sure that we're identifying synergies among the work that we do, and hopefully including management agreements so that we can actually share resources as well to continue to build and empower that local response. So again, one of our hopes from today is that we can start building that where we don't already have those partnerships and that coordination. And I'm hoping that there can be a point to, through discussion or your questions and observations, that you can help us know how you would like to be involved, what that might look like, and we can get ahead of that coordination. Again, our experience is sharing the information and really having mechanisms to pass resources amongst all the responders is going to be key. So thanks. Looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Margen, and thank you all for having me here today. Thank you to the organizers for this wonderful event. My name is Stephanie Helms, and I'm the Executive Coordinator for the Washington Invasive Species Council. And to give everyone a little bit of a background on what the council is, it was established by the state legislature in 2006 and is tasked with the policy level direction, planning, and coordination for combating invasive species that are present within Washington state, but also preventing the introduction of other ones that may be harmful. We have 22 different member agencies, and I see a few folks actually out here in the audience today, which is lovely. But we are comprised of 22, so that's federal agencies, state agencies, research organizations, tribes, and also local agencies as well. And we also do have an industry advisory panel. So we meet quarterly, and again, kind of think of us as a compass that kind of points us all in the way of where we need to go in terms of invasive species management and prevention. So we not only look for different opportunities for funding and maybe looking at creating some cross-cutting programs, maybe doing some trainings like we just saw in that video, but also trying to identify different gaps that maybe one agency wouldn't be able to fill on their own. So working together, making sure we're being good conveners and getting everybody to the table so we can, again, provide that policy level direction that empowers those who are involved in invasive species eradication management and prevention and build upon those efforts. So when the Invasive Species Council was first established, it went on its first mission of actually prioritizing what are the biggest threats here and around Washington. And with that, they actually looked at 700 different species in and around Washington, and 700 species is staggering. And of course, none of us have the resources to be able to hit all 700 of those. So how do we look at which ones to focus on and which ones to actually put resources towards? And in about 2009, the council landed on about 50 different species, looking at everything from economic impacts to agricultural impacts to ecological impacts, impacts to tourism and recreation, and also how close are they or how feasible are they to actually be able to be managed if they become introduced to Washington state. And of the number one was zebra and quagga mussels. And so that was about 18 years ago, and I think that still stands true today, that zebra and quagga mussels are one of the biggest threats to Washington state and our livelihood. To have that introduction would fundamentally change what it means to be a Washingtonian. So with that, not only do we work with the industry professionals, but one of the biggest bread and butter of the Washington Invasive Species Council is education and outreach and getting the public involved and mobilizing the public to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. Because I know I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, but anything that moves can move an invasive species. So even in people's day-to-day activities, as we see with mussel-fouled boats, we want people to be aware of their potential impact and get them involved in being part of that solution. So we have a lot of public awareness campaigns. So that's what we're really known for. So we really go into clean, drain, dry quite a bit, but we also focus on other pathways. And since we're talking about zebra quagga mussels today, we also have the Don't Let It Loose campaign as well. So focusing on that pathway that is the pet trade. So again, education, outreach, trying to get folks aware of pathways and what actions they can take to be part of the solution is really important for us. So again, we work with our different partners, try and fill those gaps, identify those opportunities, look for that funding, create those cross-cutting projects, but also we want folks to say something if they think they see something. We do have a reporting app, so we're trying to get folks involved to speak up if they potentially see an invasive species, and therefore we can get that messaging to the right folks to take the right action. So with that, that is a lightning fast overview of some of our big ticket items, and I'll pass it over to Lloyd. Thank you so much.
So when I think of roles and responsibilities for us, I mentioned earlier that obviously we're an agricultural agency, which means that it provides us, I think, a lot of flexibility in how we view the work that we have in front of us with invasive species and noxious weed management and eradication. We're fortunate that we are able to focus on those programs kind of in the way they were built for us as priorities that were sent to us, in the sense that I remember we went through a conversation with our council several years ago, and there was a lot of that, what about this species, what about that species kind of thing. And we eventually got to the same point that you just described with, well, what's the one of primary concern? We also benefit in going through that exercise that has been how a lot of our funding has been structured as appropriations have been passed over the years. A lot of focus very specifically directed by the legislature on essentially 2, 3, 4 species of concern, mussels being a primary one, some of the aquatic weeds that we deal with being the other. It does provide us, I think, with a lot of flexibility in the fact that we're also not a fish and wildlife agency, which means we don't have to be experts in that part too. We have folks, obviously, that are very bright and very dedicated in their field. And I don't refer to Nick as a biologist. He may, but what I'm trying to get to is we are able to facilitate those operations and those jobs that are tasked to us, but also able to call upon experts and folks that have those roles and responsibilities in their respective state and federal agencies. And I think that does provide us, I think, with a lot of flexibility in how we go about our work. We can come up with big, audacious plans for treatment of quagga mussels in the Snake River, and then put them in front of folks that really know all the nuances of why they need to tell us no or make amendments to it. So we get a chance to then put together an audacious plan that says, well, this is what we think we want to do. And then we can go to our federal and state agency partners and say, we need to understand, what are the impediments to this? What are we missing? What can we not do? What do we have to consider? And I think that helps us be a lot more. Understanding that role and responsibility probably allows us to also be a lot more nimble. What I didn't talk about in the presentation is last year when we initially put our plan together, and it was fairly audacious for us initially, we loaded a whole group of state and federal agency folks up on a boat and took them to Pillar Falls, where there's no other access other than by boat. We dumped everybody out on the falls and the boats left. And we told them the boats aren't coming back till we get a yes out of every one of you. And you don't get lunch. 10 or 15 minutes later, we had yeses from everybody. But we were able to have that kind of relationship and understanding everybody's roles and responsibilities. And everybody in that situation had the opportunity to make sure that we tweaked as necessary, that we considered, species concerns, all those things. And I've thought often, as I think about the last couple of years, how important that delineation of roles and responsibilities in that state and federal family have been for us. And I'm pleased that we don't have, that we have an Office of Species Conservation in our governor's office, or we have the relationships we have with Fish and Wildlife Service or the Corps or whoever, that we can essentially make assignments to them to help us with those different aspects, and we don't have to own it all. And I think that's very important. I also think that it's as we go through operationally, being able to delineate some of those things, it's important to understand up front where everybody's expertise is. And, we talked a little bit about that in the presentation I did earlier, and I think you're hearing it from the other panel members as well, in that, everybody comes to the table with those different things and perspectives that they need to have. And I think it's very important when you get in kind of that urgency of the moment that you do take a minute and make sure you understand what those things are and address them appropriately. Otherwise, we'll go on to the questions.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for that perspective. So, I think the first question I'd like to lead off with, that we've talked a lot about what Washington's doing. We heard what Idaho's doing. How can Washington and Idaho collaborate to further enhance our readiness actions across state lines?
We're doing it, Justin. We're right here. I think it's been interesting, and I'll just lead off very quickly and just say that, I'm not a neophyte in the fact that within the Pacific Northwest, Idaho is a little bit of a renegade state, politically and otherwise. And I recognize that some of the aggressiveness that we had attacked our issue with may or may not work in Oregon or Washington. And there's a lot of reasons why. And some of them are political, some of them have legal things, some of them are just, you're going to have water bodies where you just can't do it the way we did it. We're going to have water bodies where we can't do it the way we did it. And I think that interaction and collaboration that we've had, and making sure there's an openness to folks coming and seeing what we're doing on the ground, that there's that openness of knowing that you can call any of us in our program, whether it's myself or Nick or whomever, to pick our brain and learn about that. I think that collaboration and exchange of information is very important. Some of what we've learned on the technical and logistical side is probably some of the more pertinent things to you, because I think from the outset in Washington, again, you're going to have a different operational dynamic to live in than we do. Somebody asked, and I don't remember if it was one of your staff, it might have been one of your staff that came to visit, and they made two comments. One was, there's no way we could ever do this in Washington. But the other one was, just that idea of, do you worry about that you've gone too fast in this response, or that you're too aggressive? And I said, well, within Idaho, I can think of at least a dozen legislators and a governor that if we didn't move any faster than what we are, there'd be a phone call coming the other direction. And so I think you need to understand your operational dynamic. But we're certainly that collaboration, Justin. I think those channels are open, and we're just, tell us what you need. This is a good event for that.
I'll jump in here. One of the things that we can do now is just facilitate great communication. I think that's exactly what we're doing here today. But one thing that the council can do, and that we have been doing, is maintaining that communication frequently back and forth with our state and federal partners, but also our regional partners as well. We do meet monthly with other invasive species council coordinators, so that allows us to see what they're doing, what their challenges are, maybe even some interesting ideas for education outreach that we can adapt for our own audiences. So just having that open communication back and forth helps us identify those opportunities and fill those gaps again. And even in discussions with the lead agency, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, discussing where are some of your challenges? How can we help with that? Maybe it's through facilitation of different meetings. Maybe it's through different research and passing those resources back and forth for consideration. So we're always looking at different ways in which we can act now and take those actions now before we actually have an introduction here. But again, education and outreach is something really huge that we do. So as we look at this impending issue, are we going to have site-specific issues that are outside of the management and operations realm that maybe we can assist with? Maybe looking at different audiences there that we haven't engaged with in the past, that we can broaden and deepen that education with, so they understand what could happen, and if it does happen, how they can support it. So looking there, trying to make sure that if I'm receiving information, I'm getting that to the right people. Finding gaps, looking for funding is another big thing. So the council also works with different partners to apply for grants or different funding sources to come and convene and facilitate different training exercises, much like we saw in the almost Emmy Award-winning video there. And so again, but we won't know that unless we have our ear to the ground. And so that is a big role that we play. In my opening statements, I mentioned what the council is, but one thing I want to make sure that we do know is what we also aren't, and that's an action agency. we're here to support the lead agency, which is the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. So again, anything that comes across my desk, comes across my email inbox, making sure that that information reaches the right people so they can do the good work on the ground. So that's something that we have been doing. We have a great history and track record of doing, and something that we will continue to do moving forward.
One of the things I've seen work well over my career is, and it strikes me it's really apt here, and I hear the Stephanie and Lloyd talking about it as well, is that balance between roles and relationships to sort of grow the community of practice and the community of understanding and awareness and make that bigger and bigger and bigger. And then also having additional structure when we have to make decisions and take action. As Stephanie said, that there's a way of doing that in a coordinated way. And so I think that the Washington Invasive Species Council, maybe PENWAR as well, are great points of building that community of practice and sort of expanding that and expanding the abilities for people to know and understand and become involved in a lot of different ways. And something like, as I mentioned, having an official emergency response structure that we can put in place, which makes it clear how we do actually work together to make decisions in a timely way, which is part of what I hear Lloyd speaking about. And so, I'm very interested in other folks' ideas as well, but I think we have a lot of opportunity now to play to the strengths of different organizations that are already doing some of that, growing the many to many, and then providing a little bit of structure so we can take timely action. So hopefully that's a way to coordinate. And again, as Lloyd already started, I think in both cases, we probably have a huge opportunity to learn from what you've done in Idaho and incorporate that sooner than later.
All right, well, we have time for one more question. Are there any questions from the audience?
So you're here from Idaho Department of Ag, and I know Washington Department of Ag does a lot of work with invasive species. So can you talk a little bit about the role that Washington Department of Ag plays with WDFW?
Good question, Sandra. It's nice to see you. I can take a stab at that, but then the details Justin can fill in. So in Washington state statute, there's a division of labor articulated between Department of Fish and Wildlife and Department of Ag, where Department of Fish and Wildlife is responsible for aquatic invasive animals, and the Department of Agriculture has a much more sweeping role relative to other pests and also weeds and weed control. So at least for invasive mussels, this one falls pretty squarely in Washington's role and responsibilities, which is one of the reasons, it's just we've been moving forward with that division of labor. That said, I know there's a lot of coordination. Sometimes the pathways can be similar. And I think when we're talking about how to balance, as I mentioned earlier, the sort of many to many and how do we grow the community practice and awareness with some structure, that's another thing we can double back with the Department of Agriculture. Do they have any analogous situations from their responsibilities for weed and plant control that might be relevant here?
I think that's a really great summary. We are engaging our State Department of Agriculture around labeling for pesticide use, for example. And then we do communicate because we share a lot of stakeholders and they have a lot of connections that we can make. One of the things that we're really excited to look at moving forward is where there's cross-cutting issues between the two agencies. And the August Marima mossball zebra mussel incident was a great example. It was an aquatic animal that was the contaminant on an aquarium plant that's regulated by the State Department of Agriculture. And so we worked with their plant services division of nursery inspectors to look at the different wholesalers and retailers that sell those potentially contaminated products. And we actually developed joint messaging to the business owners from both state agencies because both authorities were in play. And then when we then followed up with information to each retailer and then asking for permission voluntarily to take a water sample, we sent the two staff of the two state agencies together. So while there is kind of a division of labor around the specific species, sometimes the lines get a little blurry. And luckily, through the State Invasive Species Council or just working together on a daily basis between state agencies, we're able to easily come together when need be. But yeah, I think Margen summarized it very well. Thank you.